For this edition of A Week in France, then, Dr. Andrew Smith, Senior Lecturer in Liberal Arts at Queen Mary University of London, joins us on the program. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Smith. You'll be intervening on a couple of stories that we're covering today. First up, then, already tense relations between Algeria and France escalated even further this week. And what started as a conflict over Emmanuel Macron recognizing Moroccan sovereignty over the disputed territory of Western Sahara last year, the diplomatic feud has gotten progressively worse as both nations pursue tit-for-tat retaliatory moves. Tensions arguably reaching new heights after the French Prime Minister then issued an ultimatum. Caroline Baum explains.
14 fois.
France and Algeria, French Prime Minister François Bayrou is digging in his heels. He issued an ultimatum to the Algerian government, which has repeatedly refused the repatriation of its citizens from France, on Wednesday.
It's absolutely unacceptable that this situation persists. France will ask the Algerian government to re-examine the entirety of our agreements on the matter and how those agreements are carried out.
La totalité des accords et la manière dont ces accords sont exécutés.
If Algeria does not come to the negotiating table in 6 weeks, Bayrou threatens to nullify the 1968 accords between the two countries, which gives Algerians preferential treatment with regards to immigration in France. These French citizens of Algerian descent said they were saddened by the tense relations between the two countries.
C'est lamentable.
It's regrettable. It's very clear that these are political measures.
It would be good to have dialogue and communicate as much as possible instead of making threats.
Over the past year, France and Algeria have clashed over France's support for Moroccan sovereignty in Western Sahara, the arrest of a French-Algerian writer in Algiers, and the French arrest of Algerian influencers for posts inciting violence. But migration remains the central element of the conflict. Without a response from the Algerian government, the decision of whether to get rid of the accords will fall to French President Emmanuel Macron.
Dr. Smith, so we heard one of the people interviewed in that report there saying this is just political measures. I'd like to get your view on that. Do you think there's a real diplomatic foreign policy agenda here, or is this just people like Bruno Retailleau trying to appeal to its base, his more right-wing base of being hard on Algeria, especially with the migration issue?
I mean, it's a really challenging situation, I think. Of course, you have, on the one hand, this kind of dichotomy, really, where the relations have improved recently so much with Morocco. Of course, you mentioned last July, Emmanuel Macron recognized Moroccan sovereignty in Western Sahara. We know, of course, the Moroccan head of government, Aziz Al-Kanash, was visiting Paris at the Salon de l'Agriculture just last week as well. So, while French and Moroccan relations have, really blossomed over the last year, as a result, of course, there has been this kind of collapse, really, in Franco-Algerian relations. Now, you mentioned, of course, the imprisonment of Boualem Sansal, the writer, again, who was imprisoned around comments about that sovereignty in Morocco and all the rest of it since last November. There's been this sort of tit-for-tat kind of arguments really going on. And this is where I think it has then become a useful political tool domestically as well. So I think you're dealing on the one hand with this very kind of broad geostrategic recognition around sovereignty and the competition in the region between Algeria and Morocco. But it's also become a useful political football for Bruno Retailleau. Suddenly, they're talking about, for example, the principal suspect in the attack earlier last week in Mulhouse, where somebody was killed, and of course the chief suspect was arguing around the essentially rendition back to Algeria, which has been refused. So there's a real anger around this, and it fits into the narrative of securitization, which is coming from the Interior Minister. It fits in to many of his priorities. You mentioned, of course, he is playing to the right, but this is really something which is a bigger diplomatic issue, which nonetheless has become a political football in France as it supports those priorities of securitization and clamping down on immigration that are stemming from the political right.
On the more diplomatic side, Dr. Smith, this week Emmanuel Macron also urged Algeria to help mend diplomatic ties. But of course, this began arguably, as you said, when he broke with decades of French policy by backing Morocco's autonomy plan for Western Sahara. So who really does have the power to improve relations in this situation?
Well, it's a challenging one, isn't it? There's this moment where it will ultimately fall to Emmanuel Macron, whether or not he needs to essentially tear up, as we mentioned, all these treaties, these bilateral agreements on immigration, which have really stood almost since Algerian independence. It gives many Algerian people sort of preferential free movement into France. Of course, it's a long-standing kind of interpenetration of the two communities, the two countries. But I think this does have to really ratchet down. We've seen some comments just recently from Emmanuel Macron during his visit to Portugal. He was asked about this. And of course, he said really it needs a deeper scrutiny. It needs much more kind of diplomatic work around it. And he seemed to somehow be sort of not necessarily stepping back from François Bayrou's position, but certainly seeming to play a sort of cool head in that sense. So I think it will come down to deals to be done, whether dialogue can restart. At the moment, we're in that terrible situation where essentially both camps seem to be accusing the other of, making ultimatums and being unreasonable. And until there is some rapprochement, which might take heads of state talking to each other, then I think it's going to be a very difficult time indeed. Like we said, we've got about 6 weeks for this to play out until we see whether or not these deals will ultimately be torn up.